I'm starting our meeting. I'd like to welcome you all and our guest, and I'm really honored to present the people who are here. Thank you for being with us, and people who are there in the computer. Thank you for being with us. I have a great pleasure to present you MICHEL Olivier, who is our guest and will speak about manifestation, but economics as manifestation. So I thought about this title and this presentation, and I'd like to explain that our society or association today has an objective to develop our fields of interest, and I remarked and thought that it's great to present someone and something which is phenomenological, but it's also something which transcends a little a field of phenomenology. And it's not the first guest who presents something which is not about Husserl, for example, and or Heidegger. So Michel Olivier is a program director at the Collège International de Philosophie and teaches at Paris Mental University. And he completed a doctoral thesis on the issue of the ineffable and the philosophy of language, and has published a few books and collective works about pairs, about Quine, about now about the Bergson or from Bergson to Levinas sense of human, because I have to translate, sorry for this. He also contributed to collective works about Jean-François Guyotat, Karl Polanyi, and Emmanuel Levinas. His current research focuses on the tension between economic life and forms of collective life. So I give you a word. I don't know if in English it's the same. If it's in French, I hope so. So table is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation, first of all, and thank you for devoting the time to this open discussion. It's a great pleasure for me. My nose is a little bit blocked, but I hope you won't hear that too much. And I'm going to try not to be too long, which is always a risk with me, but I'll do my best for that. The subject of today, probably I must apologize for not being a phenomenologist, but I'll do my best. The subject today is the economy. I would like to talk with you about the economy. There are many ways and many different ways to talk about the economy. You can think of the economy as an object of knowledge, obviously, as economists do, for instance. With many classical difficulties of a domain like the economy, where humans are both subject and object. So there's an epistemological problem, as it's classical. You can also, and especially for philosophers, you can also consider the economy as a political object. What do I mean by a political object? I mean a domain determining our modes of collective existence, a domain shaping forms of our collectivity, and possibly as a domain of struggle, whether it is desired or not. The economy as a political object can be celebrated sometimes, especially by liberals, sometimes by Marxists, but more often, for philosophers, the economy is an object to be criticized as a sort of monstrous mechanism overtaking our lives, rendering society incapable of self-consciousness. And because of this lack of self-consciousness, it's sort of, it is rendering us of political self-determination. So the economy is a political object, but mainly as an anti-political object. In the political view, the economy is generally a problem.
Yeah. Could you speak near the
Okay, and the camera is there and the microphone is there, right? Okay.
Sorry for interrupting.
Thank you for the advice. Yeah, of course. Thank you. Thank you for the advice. In both cases, I mean, as an object of knowledge and as a political, anti-political object, the economy is placed at a distance. It is, in a way, it is objectified, put in front of us. In the first case, as an object of knowledge, this is a distancing. This distancing is an epistemological one, and in the second case, the economy is perceived as a sort of separate objectivity, which disrupts the political mastery of our collective being. So it's a sort of distance of alienation. What I would like to advocate today with you is a totally different way of thinking about the economy. Neither as an object of knowledge and neither as a political, anti-political object, but as a cultural object. First of all, what do I mean by culture? At this stage, a very broad and general definition of culture, in the very broad sense of the collective life of our spirits. The purpose of the day of this talk is not to justify this approach. Probably it would take too long. What I would just say as a very short summary about this subject is that in my way, in my view, blaming the economy for our difficulty in being collective is probably a too easy shortcut that does not help the intelligibility of the situation. I think that our difficulty in our collective life lie in more cultural difficulty than anything else. And the economy might be viewed as just one manifestation of this cultural difficulty. What I would like to do today is just to show that it is possible. I would like to provide you with two examples. It is possible to think of the economy as a cultural object, as expressing our collective state of mind. And thinking the economy in this way is probably just asking what the economy reveals about us, what is spiritually at stake, what is spiritually at stake in our economic life. Probably all major texts on the economy, well, those that are not purely technical, of course, carry, at least implicitly, such spiritualization of the subject. But I have chosen to discuss with you two of the rare philosophers who do so explicitly and not implicitly, who approach the economy as a pathway to something far deeper than the economy itself. I can see that, and I suggest that we can see that as an analogous to certain linguists or semioticians who study language and speech, not as an object to be known, but as a means of accessing to connective life, like Chomsky is explicitly his way of working, or Langacker, or a gateway to the transcendental form of the meaning, like Peirce. It's, in a formal perspective, the same way. And in this way, the economy becomes a mode of access to something far more fundamental than just material life. And the two guys, the two philosophers I have chosen as doing so explicitly are Simmel and Levinas. Simmel, in my view, understood the economy as a manifestation of what he will call at the end of his life the tragedy of culture. And we'll talk a little bit about the tragedy of culture in the sense of Simmel and how and why the economy is a manifestation of this tragedy. And Levinas saw the economy as an ethical issue, and in my view, that can revolutionize totally the way we see the economy. I would like to begin with Simmel and with a quote, a sort of a methodological quote. The quote is from the preface of Philosophy of Money, and Simmel, in his preface, say that he seeks the connection of the superficial detail of life, in this case he talks about the economy, superficial detail, to its deepest and most essential movements. And I continue. The aim of Simmel, is to construct beneath historical materialism a level that fully preserves the explanatory value of the role of economic life among the causes of spiritual culture, while also, and the second point is, in my view, the most important, while also recognizing economic forms themselves as the result of deeper valuations and dynamics, whether psychological or metaphysical. So, in the view of Simmel, the economy can be seen not only as a cause, but also as a result of much deeper dynamics. And I would like to explore all the philosophy of money is devoted to this inquiry. I would like to develop just one side, one aspect of this research. So let's move back to a fundamental idea of this history of spiritual life. Simmel draws on the very classical distinction in spiritual life between causal series, our mode of interpretation of nature, and teleological series. The causal series, as you know, obviously, is without any beginning or end, without purpose, without project. It's just the infinite chain. It is the indifferent progression of being, where one thing leads to another without any intent. It's quite close to what Levinas would call probably Lilia, the causal theory. And the teleological theory, on the other hand, consists of means directed towards an end, and therefore it has both a starting point, an end point, and a certain level of complexity, a certain length. So the modern economy can be seen, and Simmel see it like that, can be seen as a collective domain, probably the collective domain, where theological theories are extended, are complicated, to enable the pursuit of new ends previously inaccessible, so new machine, new tools, new processes, new knowledge, new techniques, everything like that for new objects, new needs, new adventure, new project, and so on. And this works through, of course, a very intense division of social labor. And all these extensions and refinement of teleological theory within the economy are designed to expand the field of human possibility. So far, so good, and so far, very classical. However, Simmel identifies very rapidly a profound paradox that became classical much later after him, with, I would say, in a way, with all the degrowth theory, with guys like Serge Latouche, Ivan Illich, André Gorz, and so on. But much before that, Simmel explained the following thing. As teleological theories grows longer and more complex within the economy, becoming deeply interconnected, the individual actor, the individual agent, loses sight of the ultimate end. The individual participant, if you prefer, in the economic process becomes totally absorbed in a specific task, very local task, a small link in a very long and very complex chain. And the final goal, the end of the teleological process, is so far removed from the immediate action of the individual that it effectively vanishes from his consciousness. So the economy, initially a portfolio of means to achieve collective ends, becomes a sort of autonomous system whose purpose is totally absent from the perspective of the individual. It is not an objective nonsense. It is, if I may say, a phenomenological critique. It is not an objective nonsense. It is just a phenomenological paradox. For us, the final end disappears. A few examples. I think that we can say that with very few exceptions, and probably a profession of philosophy is one of those exceptions, but with very few exceptions, the concrete experience of the labor, of the salaried labor, is not felt, is not experienced as consciously directed toward a social end. The worker is generally totally focused on achieving a sort of competitive efficiency, probably in service of an abstract social purpose, but that remains totally indeterminate for him. The ultimate social end, and Simmel provides many examples of that, the ultimate social end of an economic series, whether they exist or not, it's not a technical description, whether they exist or not, anyway, it lies beyond the scope of the individual worker's consciousness. And more amazingly, even the entrepreneur process, which can be seen as the foundation of our modern economy, and the entrepreneur process has largely lost its teleological character. The entrepreneur generally begins his adventure just by becoming aware of a technical means, which in itself is not directed toward anything. And then he explores about the business opportunities that might arise from this new means. He's seeking or hoping for compelling potential use that remain entirely indeterminate. At the moment, the means emerge. Thus, in the entrepreneur démarche, adventure, the means precedes the end, which is no longer an end, of course, but rather, we could say, a potential and indeterminate opportunity. Just two examples, a very concrete example. The generalization of automobile enabled the emergence of hypermarket. But hypermarket has never been the intended end of the automobile, obviously. Today, artificial intelligence is currently seeking its potential application, anticipated as both brilliant and dangerous, but anyway, these use remain today largely still undefined. So the economy reveals itself to us not as a system of sophisticated theological theories, as it might have been originally, but as interconnected and sometimes circular series, marked by some unexpected emergence of means that enable other means. So our individual prosperity is drawn from this economic profusion through wages. And finally, wages and money are become the universal goal for the individual. So the economy has totally lost its theological meaning for us. I would like to put the emphasis on the fact that these statements from Simmel is not just a restatement of the idea that the process of accumulation serves only its own expansion. It's not a Marxian statement because it is not specifically linked to capitalism. It is linked just to collective economic complexity and efficiency through division of labor. Division of labor is not synonymous as capitalism. It is a condition of capitalism, but there are many economies with very strong division of labor. That is not capitalism, of course. So within the spiritual category of teleology, a successful economy undergoes a mutation into its opposite. The extension of teleological power is the economy's vocation, and its very success necessarily involves the lengthening, the complexification of theological theories, and therefore the very success of this teleological complexity leads to a disintegration of teleological meaning for us. And this transformation paradoxically reshaped totally the economy for us. It becomes a field of unpredictable emergences whose dynamics elude us and seem almost quasi-causal instead of teleological, a system from which we can extract subsistence and even prosperity, but nothing like teleological system or theories. The interesting point is the following one. This is quite a classical description of the economy, even if Simmel is one of the first to provide us with it. But the interesting point is the following one. It is that this paradoxical shift of the economy into a kind of second nature, to a kind of causal systemic mechanism, is not primarily perceived as a political problem, as a political disposition. Rather, in the view of Simmel, it reflects a universal difficulty in collective being, something that I could describe as a divorce between objective spirit and subjective spirit. It is a kind of tragedy that Simmel, a few years later, exactly 11 years later, will name tragedy of culture. And now, let's move to a very rapid description of this object, tragedy of culture. Simmel used to belong to a neo-Kantian school, and with this school, within this school, they understand culture as a synthesis of two poles, an objective pole and a subjective pole. The objective pole is composed of the repository of all historical production of the spirit, works of arts, books, knowledge, moral law, economy, knowledge, plans, so on and so on, with patents and so on. The subjective pole, that is in the individual subject, were engaged with this repository, appropriating it in a spiritual journey interpreted as self-realization. So, if you want, reading books, viewing painting, and so on, this is not a culture. Culture begins when such practices are experienced as contributing to making the individual the person he is potentially. That is the self that demands cultivation. And what is the tragedy of culture? This idea rests, to put it in a very short way, on the understanding that this synthesis between objective and subjective pole, that is culture, then this synthesis is doomed to fail for quasi-transcendental, unsurmountable reasons. Why? In a very short way, the objective pole organizes itself into, I would say, provinces governed by rules, norms, institutionalization, and become rigidified, like ossified, self-justifying. It becomes, in the later vocabulary of Simmel, it becomes a form. And meanwhile, the subjective pole, the living individual striving for self-construction, cannot allow itself to be confined within this rigid form, and it finds dissatisfaction with it. So it finds dissatisfaction with what they had originally contributed. but which has been ossified, alienated from them. So institutionalization is necessary to give shape to the collective life of spirit, and the ossification of this institution into fixed norm and form is also inevitable. That's why we call that a tragedy. A few basic examples. Well, very basic example, just to give some ideas of the effect of this rigidification of the objective whole that opposes the ambition of the individual. The artist, frustrated by academic conventions. The student, regimented by rules that totally fail to resonate with the desire for knowledge. Religious yearnings, betrayed by the institutions of church. Political ideals betrayed by the inertia of political parties. Even language designed to enable expression, language has to develop some grammatical form, grammatical structure, and this very grammatical structure produces inexpressible because it produces limits. A profusion, it's an example of Simmel, a profusion of academic works, let's say some thesis, for instance, perfect in their formal execution, but in the view of Simmel, entirely disconnected from the original spark of the adventure of knowledge. And Simmel will call this a little bit later the conflict between institutional forms and creative life. Probably, this vocabulary is a generalization of the Marx idea of the conflict between the forms and the force of production, but it's regeneralization, of course. So, the production of the spirit objectify themselves in institutions that become alien to the desire that gave birth to them. And it is the very success of this collective spiritual life that invites this rigidification, and with it, the tragic becoming. So, the theological deformation of the economy we have begun with is a particular case of this tragedy of culture. It is almost explicit within the text of Simmel. Not exactly, we can talk about this during the discussion. It's not exactly explicit. It is halfway of being explicit. Let's describe this particular case in the term of tragedy of culture. Humanity embarks on the economic adventure to achieve some specific ends. Mastery of the world, securing subsistence and enjoyment, overcoming misery, producing object of delight, and so forth. And yet, the very success of the economy requires immanent dynamic that ultimately overpower the living purposes of the individual and come into conflict with them. So we need forms, but the forms, whatever they are, suffocate us. And of course, the teleological void that ensues is filled, but what remains, and what remains in the economy is money. So the worker's wage and the investor's surplus value take total precedence over the living end of the subject involved. But I think we would be wrong to criticize this as just a lack of rationality. Because, you know, the reason why the closure of a factory is a disaster in itself, and it is a disaster in itself, even if the products that came out from this factory were no longer of any use. So there is something beyond the end, beyond the teleological end, there is something inherent to the economy that takes prevalence. Probably, without the capitalist system, we could say that the gain of bureaucratic power could play the same role as money in the system. So it's not a matter of capitalism. It's a matter of complexity, of becoming institution. And every cultural production, once objectified, generates its own norms and immanent processes that become totally alien to the desires that initially gave rise to them. And this contradiction that I tend to see as even more fundamental than the Marxian or the Polanyian contradiction is tragic. What does it mean it is tragic? It means that Simmel offers no resolution through any dialectical reconciliation, except at the end of his life, but it's another story. In the text I work, especially tragedy of culture, there is nothing like a dialectical reconciliation. So here, the economy serves as just an expression and illustration of a much deeper spiritual rift, the divide between forms and life, through the process of tragedy of culture. And here the economy is not a cause of sort of monstrous that have to be killed in order to enable us to be happy, collectively happy, and so on. It is not the effect of this divide, it is a mode of manifestation, circulating both cause and effect. So this was the first part with Simmel. Let's move to Levinas, and then we will get to general conclusion. Let's move to Levinas. Levinas and the economy. It's not its main topics, at least apparently. I have recently discovered that the economy is a very important topic for Levinas, and I try to understand what we can learn from the way Levinas sees the economy. I would like to begin with this phrase that he mentioned very often. It's from the rabbinic tradition. The material needs of the other are my spiritual needs. So this is explicitly what I'm trying to do, and immerse the economy within something much more important than the economy. So it's a direct way to immerse material life into life of the spirit. The economy is more than what it appears to be, far more than subsistence and prosperity. And this more, we are going to see that in detail, this more is not political. This is what is amazing. It is not political in Levinas. It is spiritual, which is in Levinas means ethical, of course. So let's try to understand this a little bit better. And I would like to do so through three texts very shortly, as short as I can, very shortly. Three texts of Levinas. The first one is Totality and Infinity, the major works of 1961. And as you know, or of course all of you know this book, so I'll try to be quite fast. This book can be seen as a sort of a narrative aiming to consider the possibility that something might happen to the human beings that was not supposed to happen. And this happening would make the human beings an exception in nature, and it is the emergence of exteriority, in the sense of exteriority to the self. So the possibility of being radically, you all know the conception of exteriority in Levinas, the possibility of being radically disturbed, destabilized by an alterity that cannot be anticipated nor assimilated, the other. And in ordinary life, anything that might appear as exteriority, that might pretend to be exteriority, turns rapidly into interiority. The book begins with this idea. And one of the aspects of this transformation of pseudo-exteriority into interiority, one of the way of rejecting exteriority, put it another way, is the economy. The economy shatters the alterity of the object of need. And in this way, it turns exteriority into interiority. Exactly just as knowledge shatters the alterity of the object in general. or the economy, each chapter the alterity of the object of need. And for Levinas, as you know, need is the enjoyment of its satisfaction, enjoyment of nature, food, light, and so on. But of course, we are worried because enjoyment could end. Nothing is guaranteed in nature. And at this stage, the object of need is experienced as exteriority because we are worried. Nothing is guaranteed. I could lose everything. I could lose my enjoyment. I could lose my life. And we must therefore organize working, storing, planning, possessing, building a dwelling that becomes a sort of outside nature to secure enjoyment. And this is the economy. The economy is nothing less than securing enjoyment. The economy overcomes the alterity of that which I need. So the primary meaning of the economy in Levinas, in totality and infinity, is the securing of the impermanent enjoyment offered by nature. So nature is a pseudo-exteriority and mutates into interiority within the economy. This is the first step. Second step, this economic mutation becomes a place where true exteriority is discovered, the real one, this one. Because the economy is designed to turn nature into a human world. So the immediate and innocent enjoyment mutates within the economy into a sort of mastery of the object. And the object within this mastery becomes possession, possession within the dwelling. The possession is economy. And possession is something that can be contested by the other. So the other approaches and contests me within the economy. The first thing that he contests is my possession. So the encounter of the other is within the economy. So I discover the pure exteriority. I discover the question of the legitimacy of my enjoyment within the economy. Of course, the economy is just the beginning of the story, as you all know. It's the beginning of the relationship with the other. This relationship, if I may say so, will take all its full dimension in teaching, in language, in construction of the shared world, and so on. But it is in the economy that the full sovereignty of my interiority is broken. Levinas writes, it's personal translation, probably worth nothing, but anyway, the language accomplishes the original commoning, which refers to the possession and supposes economy. So even the language supposes economy through the story that I have just mentioned. Of course, I can remain totally deaf to this consultation and instrumentalize the other through violence. But if I hear the "you shall not kill," so the economic contestation of the other becomes my discovery of exteriority, and the ethical adventure can begin. Thus, the economy in Levinas, after being the security of my enjoyment, becomes the encounter of the other, starting from my egoism, and then the discovery of the possibility of the ethical responsibility. Step 2. But in this development of the meaning of the economy, something obviously is missing. Something is clearly missing. What is missing, this in my view, in my understanding, is that the economy is generally not understood as a dual relationship between self and the other. It is a social matter. It is a communal relationship. Economy is a form of totalization of social beings. It forms a system. And the political meaning of the economy lies in this becoming social. And totality and infinity, in this book, Levinas doesn't address directly the economy in this dimension. At least he does. In a way he does. But it does so negatively. in the section called The World of Phenomena and Expression, and also a little bit later in the section The Ethical Relationship and Time. There, in these two sections, the economy becomes a social matter, but it becomes the world of works, les œuvres, works, the world of objects produced within the economy and thrown in the transactional social totalization. And this world of works betrays, is described by Levinas as betraying me because it doesn't express me. Works, economic production of objects, unlike language, are not addressed. They form a sort of anonymous system through money. A work is not the social truth of its agent. So the economy is a kind, in this text, in this passage, is a kind of truncated sociality. The economy is a world of relationship. Actually, it's a quote of Simmel, but I think that Levinas could adopt it and claim it. The economy is a world of relationship from which the relata, ourselves, have disappeared. So the authentic expression is only possible in discourse, in Levinas, you know that, where I expose myself to the questioning of the other, and that is in teaching and so on. Exactly as if the meaning of the economy, the original source of the questioning of the self by the other, that what we have just mentioned, we have described the meaning of the economy as that, the original source of the questioning of the self by the other. It happens exactly as if this original meaning could not extend beyond the ethical self, the self and the other, towards the multiplicity of the social, as if it necessarily ends up forming a system that forgets this original ethical contact. As if you want to put it another way, as if voluntary transaction were a false overcome of the contestation beyond the number of two. In Levinas, in many texts of Levinas, we can find a lot of trace of Marx. But in Levinas, this deficiency of the economy, the fact that it is not, it cannot be properly social, is true not only for the economy, but he finds this deficiency in all the universals. You can find some part of totality and finity as explained that states and history, exactly the same way as the economy, loses its ethical meaning while becoming a collective system. So the vocabulary is often that of Marx, but probably not the meaning. So for the moment, and unlike Simmel, Levinas remains in the ethical self of the self and the other, except to describe the economy as just a sort of truncated sociality. But Levinas does not stop there, and that's what is, in my view, the most interesting. It doesn't stop there, and by doing so, it doesn't politicize the argument. So I would like to put some details on that. We know that at the end of The Otherwise Than Being, the other major work, ethics is totally immersed in the collective as a problem of the third, the famous Levinasian problem of the third. So just to summarize the problem of the third, we are faced with a multiplicity of others within the collective, and I no longer know what to do with my ethical responsibility toward each because I am just overwhelmed by the number of others. And this situation of the world, the overwhelming of the number of others, both justify the social knowledge, science, philosophy, and so on, and at the same time limit it. But in this book, the economy is not addressed. However, it is addressed in another text, much earlier, a small text called The Self and the Totality that you may know, which immediately immerses the economy in the question of the collective. And this text in my view, it's very, very, very important and interesting to understand the economy in Levinas. Levinas, in this text, it's a text of 654, so it's quite an early text. Levinas seeks a relationship between the self and the social totality. And he warned that this relationship does not amount to pure participation in the totality. He is looking for something where the self would not be dissolved into the whole. And strangely enough, he finds that in economy, in economic totalization. It's quite strange. Economy, in this text, produces social totalization because the transaction, economical transaction, form a system. And it totalizes beyond the intimate society, at least in the world of Levinas, at the appropriate social scale. Unlike the sociality of love, Levinas doesn't like the sociality of love. Not that it doesn't like love, but it doesn't like to build a sociality through love. And yet, it totalizes on a very large scale, the economy, and on a very large scale without dissolving the self into the anonymity. Unlike the social science, in the social science, the individual is totally determined by external anonymous systemic conditions, and in a way, the individual is dissolved. Not in the economy. Why? In the economy, there is no dissolution of the self within this totalization, because each person remains free to say yes or no to the transaction. But, of course, this freedom is totally fake. This freedom is betrayed by the seduction of necessity, the seduction or the necessity of money. Levinas writes, money is always, to some degree, a wage to be understood in Marxian sense. So there is assent from the self, but this is a deceptive assent. Thus, the economy involves totalization while preserving the singularity of the self, since freedom are formalized and maintained, but this totalization is made and can only be made of the very fabric of injustice, economical injustice, a specifically economic injustice that betrays freedom without denying freedom. For Levinas in this text, the important point is there. The economy, the injustice of economy betrays freedom without denying them. So the economy, when immersed in collective life, plays a very ambiguous role. It enables society to exist without dissolving separateness from the totality, since the agent retain its formal freedom of action, but it does so and can only do so through injustice. Injustice can be expressed, and in my view, when Levinas writes injustice, we can also understand injustice as experienced as a call for justice. So for Levinas, collective being in economy is not at all a tragedy, as Simmel. It is a sociality between separated individuals, but an insatisfactory sociality that calls for something else. The totalization of the economy is a call, is a domain where we hear the call for something else. So the question, the final question now is, what is this something else that is called by the economy? And I think that for Levinas, this sociality, this other sociality, not economical sociality, is not at all what we could expect, I mean, a political society. In his view, there is no economic on one side, the bad guy, and the political on the other side, the good guy. This is not the right category for him. The right sociality, the right totalization, is rooted in law, with a big L, grounded in the transcendent verticality of the other. And this something else that we are looking for can appear totally unrelated to the economy. The economy can even be seen as the inverse of the sociality of law. And in the words of Levinas, we can often find the phrase, the expression, economy of being. The economy of being is often found in Levinas' work, and this just means we must go beyond the economy because the economy is just the economy of being in the Iliad. But I do not believe that this reading of Levinas is entirely accurate. And I would like to end this talk with this idea. Economy still plays a fundamental role in this other sociality of Levinas. And I quote, in Totality and Infinity, I quote Levinas, welcoming the other is not played out beyond the economy. Welcoming the other is not beyond the economy. So the economy must play a very serious role. Which one? My hypothesis is that we must take very seriously the role of economic totalization through injustice in forming society. Totalization beyond intimacy and without crushing individual singularity. In the very beginning of the text, The Self and the Totality, Levinas introduces economy as the locus of guilt and innocence. Guilt and innocence within this injustice. Injustice which is not always known as injustice. Levinas put the emphasis on this idea. The economic injustice is an injustice that is not always known as injustice. I just remark that this is the strict reversal of Hayek. I don't know if you are familiar with the economist, philosopher Hayek. It is the exact reversal of the claim of Hayek, who sees in the spontaneous economic order the impossibility of guilt and innocence, because they will never intend. Economic misery is always an unintentional systemic consequence, so no guilt. For Hayek. For Levinas, it is the exact opposite. Even when the injustice is not intended and not even known as such, I am guilty or innocent. So if we try to be very clear and concrete in the meaning of this guilt, what does it mean, being guilty without knowing it? What does it mean exactly? In any economic act, buying a pair of shoes, the face of the third generally is a child who likely made them in Asia, appears to me. In the act of flying for a vacation, the face of the third who will soon die from the suffocation of the climate change also appears to me. But if I refrain from flying, the misery of the hotel worker who will be laid off due to my absence also appears to me. But this is because this very simple example, this is because I am in a singular economic relationship with every person whose unjust space I might cause, even without knowing it or willing it. Economy is a field of pure involuntary harm. So, economy is a social sphere, it's a social field where the relationship with the third is anything but abstract, where the ethical contradiction of the third seizes me on a daily basis. Because it is a sphere where I am guilty every day of the harm I can cause beyond my intention and even beyond my awareness. And I will finish with the third text, a book Beyond the Self and the Totality. We can find many Levinas writings that confirm this reading of the economic conception of Levinas. And I would like just to mention the book Beyond the Verse, that you may know, one text called The City of Refuge. And the text is a description of what we can call the unintentional crimes. Unintentional crimes, someone who causes a death unintentionally, by accident. And Levinas said this guy is both semi-guilty and semi-innocent. He cannot be condemned, it was not intended, but the victim relatives, may seek vengeance. And in the Bible, the law recognizes this desire. The city of refuge exists in the Bible to protect this semi-guilty individual from vengeance. But Levinas explicitly and immediately states this semi-guilt story as a metaphor for the semi-guilt situation of the Western individual in the economy. Everyone, it's a quote, everyone is in some sense someone else rich person. And everyone can cause disasters on the other side of the world without knowing or intending it. And Levinas describes the urban anonymity of large city exactly as our city of refuge. And the popular anger, of course, is the vengeance of the relative of the victim. So Levinas here confirms explicitly that he views economic totalization as both a field of unintentional fault and a domain of ethical connection with the absent yet singular third who suffers from my unintentional fault. In his own word, he said the economy is the domain of subjective innocence and objective guilt. Very easy to understand. We act with good intention, subjective innocence, but those intentions are betrayed by the unintended consequences of our action, objective guilt. So the unintentional crimes, that is economic injustice that totalizes the social, is possible only, according to Levinas, these unintentional crimes are possible only in a society that recognizes this distinction between objective guilt and subjective innocence. And it's a distinction that we could judge as purely liberal, Hayekian, or things like that. But Levinas doesn't call that a liberal civilization. He calls that a political civilization. A political civilization. A civilization that protects subjective innocence and forgives objective guilt, according to Levinas, is a political civilization. Systemic problem, personal innocence. That's what is important in economy for Levinas. But not only in the economy. Economy just as a manifestation of the collective problem. Systemic problem, personal innocence. And so tolerating the involuntary left behind of the systemic political project. So here in Levinas, political clearly is not the good guy. Again, the economy, which would be the bad guy. The political is the bad guy, and the economy is just the locus where it comes to manifestation. It's really strange and amazing. So this political civilization can only be surpassed by a civilization of law. And what is exactly law? It remains always vaguely defined in Levinas. But what is important for us, and I will conclude here, what is important for us is that economic sociality is indeed a truncated and imperfect sociality, but not because it prevents a political society, but because as a political society, it turns blind eye to its systemic character and forgets its original ethical meaning. And it is in the economic domain, and this is the interesting character of economy, it is in the economic domain that this ethical imperfection of any political civilization manifests, and where the relevance of law becomes evident. And a last text, very short, just 2 or 3 phrases, in the Pact, it's another text of the same book. Levinas addresses the question of economic globalization and what we call the emotional loss of community. We can think of philosopher like Ferdinand Tönnies or Polanyi, the fact that the economy make a closely affective relationship with the other, the community warmth of the social life. In this text, there is discussion, but the assertion, the final assertion is very clear. Professional life, that is large-scale division of labor, is the seriousness of things. The affective relationship of the intimate community, the entre-soi, or the affective relationship of local tradition does not constitute the proper sociality. Because responsibility is the right gaze, the just gaze that reaches beyond intimacy. And so he formulates here, and that's why I mentioned this text, Levinas formulates this idea: the ultimate purpose of the law is to make large-scale society a quasi-community beyond intimacy. So the law is in lieu of affect in the economy. So social totalization beyond intimacy is therefore economic in Levinas. An economy with its cohort of injustice calls for civilization beyond the political. We may think that it sounds like Marx, and in a way it sounds like Marx. Like Marx, but probably not like Marxism. Because here, getting rid of capitalism is not the key of the collective happiness. The key of the collective happiness is the law. And the important matter is the fact that any system forgets its original ethical meaning. So Simmel left us with a tragedy, seeing economy as an immediately cultural collective being. And there is something tragic for him in modern collective being, since form opposes life. The very generic and general problem, form opposes life, manifests itself in the economy among other ways of manifestation. This is what Simmel left. But Levinas, on the other hand, sees the economy as a counter of the other, and especially of the third, in the possibility of injustice. And therefore, the economy is a locus of manifestation of the ethical need to go beyond a political civilization. That's it. We have mentioned two examples of attempts to think of the economy not as an objectivity to be known, and not as a political, anti-political problem, but just as a contemporary manifestation of what is at stake in the modern difficulty of being collective. Thank you very much. I hope I've not been too long. I'm afraid I have been more.
Okay. It's perfect. I try to thank you very much for your speech. Multi-dimensional and methodologic and very interesting. I'd like to invite you to ask questions if you have some. I didn't know, but someone writes that our presentation weren't seen.
Really? Oh.
I didn't know, sorry for that. So, if you have any questions, it's a good time to ask, because we have this occasion. So, why we wouldn't ask questions? Yeah. So you have some questions. I'd like to start. I have to check if it's not questions here. Angela. Hello, Angela. Are you there? Hi.
Hi, I am there, or I am here.
Jay.
Hello. Here.
Hello, Michel. I have a question which concerns the position of money in the construction you made, but it would be rather directed to Simmelian part than to the Levinasian part. And this question concerns the moment of teleological end and its disintegration in economy. And now I am thinking, is it not so that money is a way of reintegrating the social end in the modern society? Let's say the society of the industrial production of goods. And so we have two processes. One process is disintegration of the teleological end by the economical process, and the reintegration of this end by the sign or signifier of money. And then it would be synonymous with the proposition that capital becomes the end in the sense of horizon of modern teleology. This would be my question.
Could you repeat just the last sentence? I'm not sure I've heard just your last sentence.
The last sentence is that if we could agree that the reintegration
Yes.
of the teleological end makes it oriented on money, then the capital would become the dynamic or the intentional direction of this end, or even I would say a horizon of this modern teleology.
Okay. Thank you for this question. It is a question because Simmel explicitly described money as an end, the new end.
This is why I asked this question, because it is after the quite perspicacious lecture of the philosophy of money.
Yeah, and he described that as an end. But if we see the question through the problematic or through the category of tragedy of culture, we can probably understand that this new end is the typically kind of false or fake end that emerge from the ossification of the institution. Why? Because originally, the end of the economy were oriented toward enjoyment, subsistence, prosperity, and things like that. In the tragedy of culture, in the text, the tragedy of culture, Simmel mentioned the example that within the economy, we cannot stop our activity to product whose end and whose utility in terms of social ends are clearly understood. The mechanism and the necessity of the immanent rule of capitalism has the consequences that you have to generate growth. And through generating growth, you have to add some new products that are totally nonsense in terms of social ends. And it just makes sense only if money becomes an end. And it is asserted by Simmel. Money becomes an end. But in the writing of Simmel, this end is a pathological end. Because money is the archetype of the means. Money in a way, like intellectual life, like conceptual life, money is something that can be devoted to anyone, to anything, to any direction. So money has typically the form of a means, the super means, the means of the means, and within our system, it becomes an end. So of course, it is an end, but in my understanding, it is a pathological end because it's an immanent end within the system of capitalism. Exactly as in a bureaucratic economy, the gain of power within the bureaucracy would be the new end, immanent end, that would take place of the social end. Exactly in the same way. But the important point is that for Simmel, and I tend to agree with him, money is an end only in an immanent way of a system, of a mechanism that is totally disconnected with the social end. This became very classical. All the degrowth theory has the same claim. But within Simmel, what is interesting exactly is that it can emerge your question, that money gets the meaning of an end. You are right. But for Simmel, and for me, it cannot be a human end or a social end. It is, for him, it is clearly within the immanent logic of capitalism, a sort of void that is filled with a sort of false end, exactly as in the academy, the production of theses and other theses and other theses are also an immanent end, even if the fundamental content of the theses are really not very socially relevant or scientifically relevant. But he mentioned the example that production of academic works, perfect, flawless, without any interest in terms of social end. And you could ask, but the production of works, of theses, is the new end. But Simmel said, no, it's an immanent end. It's not a social end.
Okay, thank you. We could discuss what would be at the end in Simmel the criterion of not pathological and pathological, but I think maybe some persons would like to ask questions also.
What's this question? You're intimidated by category of opinion.
It can happen, but the economy frozen the situation.
So, Andre, if you want to ask your question to continue, you can. If you like. If you like. Do you want to continue and ask other question or not?
It is the question to me. You ask me the question if I want to ask a question.
If you want to continue, because there
Okay,
is,
yes, I would like to continue because if there is no other questions, because in Levinas it is quite clear what is the criterion. The criterion of justice and injustice is a quite clear way to understand why something is rather, let's say, ethical and other things are non-ethical. But in Simmel, it is not so clear for me because would it be the distinction between natural, in your opinion, between natural and not natural, or what would be this criterion which would give us the possibility to say this is a human end and this is a pathological end?
Yeah. Probably you can find it's a difficult question, but because Simmel doesn't explicit this distinction, even if it is implicit everywhere. But in the last chapter, the chapter 6, called Style of Life of the book, he proposed the following distinction. He said that the category of willingness, the category of la volonté, the category of will, is something that introduces within the spiritual life an affective link from the subject to an end, anything like an end. And for him, he described the fact that an end is being reached. He described this fact of reaching an end as an enjoyment, personal or collective enjoyment. And probably the main criteria of what distinguishes an end natural or legitimate and an end that could be described as pathological is the fact that it is an end in the sense of providing the affective enjoyment of, I would say, fulfilling one's destination in his life. And for him, all what is called a mean, but also all what is called intellectual life, all what is called scientific life, all what is called conceptual life, not only transaction, but also our work of concept, is in the category of means, because there is nothing like an affect enjoyment in that. There is no affect enjoyment in the fact of developing a proper reasoning. What is source of affective enjoyment is not the proper reasoning, but if what you reach behind this reasoning. And what he's saying is that the characteristic of the modern society is that the means are overwhelming with regard to the ends, affective ends, economic and intellectual means. And for him, the criteria is a sort of affective self-realization in the enjoyment of fulfilling a proper end. Mm-hmm. And for him, and I would agree with that, with one exception. I will mention the exception just later. But generally, Simmel described our life as poor in affective enjoyment, at least our collective life, exactly for the reason that all our collective life are devoted to means, intellectual means, economic means, but just means. And where do we feel really alive? In our individual, local, and personal life. Friends, family, love, and things like that. And he described our society as the loss of the collective enjoyment of affective reaching ends. The only end that remain to us are local, individual, friendship, family. And for him, it's impossible within money, when you go to work for a salary at the end of the month, or when you just produce and correct text and text and text. For him, there is no way that in this activity, there is a collective affective end that could count for an enjoyment. I will mention an exception within the economy that clearly becomes a sort of incredible enjoyment. And this is when the economy becomes a way to modify the world and to create something like can be called an empire, an economical empire. I would mention all the heroes that we know in the Silicon Valley. They do not obviously experience their economic life as just a way to get money. It's clearly a self-elaboration, an auto-development. And in my view, in the criteria of Simmel, this kind of economic adventure must be seen as an end. Elon Musk built an end. All the guys of the Silicon Valley are in this adventure of moving the world, altering the world. And this is a collective end that is really warm, with character, with enjoyment. But this is exceptional. Generally, in your economic life, there is no affective enjoyment. And this is, in my understanding, the main distinction, the main criteria between a false end and a real end. The capacity of building a warm enjoyment.
I see here the root of the German philosophy of life. And I would say you can find something very similar in a way in Polanyi and even in Lukács, I would say, young Lukács before he became Marxist. And I'm very doubtful when you say that money or capital cannot be a source of affective goal or link. If you read French literature or even German literature with Buddenbrooks or Polish literature with Lalka, you will find a lot of persons which feel enormous enjoyment and link with purely mercantile objectives or ends.
First, I agree with the first part of your statement. That is, that we hear the philosophy of life here. You are totally right. And Simmel moved himself from its young or early neo-Kantian philosophy to a philosophy of life. There is a life turn in Simmel, and it's not explicit, but we can understand that it's mainly through the reading of Bergson that it will occur. And I also agree with the idea that Polanyi is quite close to that, partially close to that. It is close to that in the final judgment, that it's impossible to build an enjoyment through money. For Polanyi, it's clearly the case. You are right. Now, the question of can we build, can we feel, can we experience an economical adventure as a collective living adventure and self-realization with affective enjoyment? Well, we could discuss.
When you see some photographs or movies from the stock markets, the enjoyment of these people when some actions are growing or the value of actions are growing, you see a collective enjoyment.
Collective enjoyment in the sense of nobody is sad of making money, obviously. But I would make an analogy with the war. Economy looks like war. You can say that in a way, when you are a professional of the army, there is a collective enjoyment of the war for itself, and there is a collective enjoyment of the victory, and there is something like that. I would not think that we can deduce from the fact that we invest our affective ambition in this kind of thing. I would not conclude that war is a source of collective enjoyment. I mean, you have the enjoyment of the victory. You have the enjoyment of being the stronger. You have the enjoyment of defeating someone in economy as in war. But behind that, considering it as a collective life, not a personal adventure against the other, but as a collective life, I have some difficulty to accept the idea that this can be considered as the enjoyment of the money itself. And I would provide you with one example. I don't know if you have remarked that not all, but many billionaires invest in works of art. Some of them
Works of, I didn't.
of art.
Ah, yes. Mhm.
Many of them build a collection. Many of them try to build something and to leave something to the posterity through money, but through money, not with money. I mean, nobody at the end of his life can measure, can evaluate, can assess the success of his life only in pure terms of figures. But if he has gathered a wonderful collection, Pinot did, for instance, like Arnaud with the Louis Vuitton Foundation do, even like Patrick Drahi did with Sotheby's, I think. It's not always a collection. Sometimes it's clearly the business of art, but clearly in this way of adoring the arts, when you are a billionaire, there is something very striking. And I understand this thing striking in the fact that the main difference between works of art and money is the notion of distinction. I mean, every object of art, every work of art is unique. And there is something incredibly powerful and striking and emotional in the fact of exhibiting something unique. But nothing looks like $1 billion more than another with $1 billion. So this difference is really striking. And the fact that there is a sort of fascination from the billionaire to the arts might prove that the enjoyment of money keeps the meaning of the enjoyment of the possibility of achieving, not of achieving. But achievement has to be made. Sometimes it is through mécénat. I don't know the English word for mécénat. Sometimes it's through art. A few centuries ago, it was through some generous gift to the church, but it was the unlimiting of the money. So I keep my doubt toward the fact that money can become an end. It is.
I understand your point. The only thing I am suspicious, a little suspicious, is the true interest or art as end for billionaires. But this would be another subject. But the question would be, if there are billionaires or people who are enjoying money without other ends, for example, no art, no church, no charity, no going to Mars, only money for money, as Picsou in French culture.
Yeah. Well, if I answer with the language of mathematics, I would say that it is not because X exists such as P of X that makes P a legitimate predicate. It's not because you can find an example, a singular example or many singular examples of something that it makes legitimate. You can always see a singular example of something as something strange. Because why? In the name of what is it strange? In the name of traditions, in the name of in the name of statistics, there are exceptions, in the name of looking strange to the others, in the name of theories that look at them as strange, and things like that. The fact that you can name me some people who seem to enjoy, for me, it doesn't prove anything. But, well, that's right. This kind of people exist. I would consider that exactly the way I would consider a general in the military career that is enjoying the fight for the fight. Can it be considered as a collective end? Well, in a sense, we could answer, by definition, it is not a collective end, a social end, because it is of the benefit of one. Well, it's a little, it's sort of, I recognize that this argument is quite, well, it's quite difficult. It's not 100% legitimate, but in a way, yeah, someone can individually enjoy economic victory, but it doesn't mean that it contributes to collective end. And the idea was the idea of collective end.
Okay, I think we will continue another time because
Okay.
we are starting the discussion about what is the status of conditions of possibility, and this would be a long discussion.
Next lecture.
Thank you.
But thank you for your for this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. We are now very intimidated by you two. So if someone has a question,
please. A simple, short question. Discussion here. It seems that the crucial concept has been joined.
In Simmel, yeah, in Simmel.
And you have introduced this concept in Levinas also, saying that the objective sphere
the beginning
of the economy protects private or subjective good. Now, my simple question is, because I do not know the text of Levinas in French, what did you join on in recently?
Yeah.
Because if it is the case, then it will situate this theoretically in an entirely different world, in the world of Jacques Lacan, for example, with the whole diversity, so to say, ambiguity of concept of free sense. I mean, from the very idealistic truly of Saint Augustine to the pain and aggression. I mean, this is the world of psychoanalysis. I regret So this is my question. Could it be, according to you, interpreted in these terms?
Thank you for this question. I would begin with Levinas because in my reading it's quite simple. I don't see any way of reading the word jouissance in Levinas in this way. Because in the beginning of Totality and Infinity, the jouissance is something very innocent. It's with the man of the very beginning that is in a way within himself, within his interiority, living nature as an immediate jouissance without any elaboration or conceptual elaboration or anything like that. It's very immediate, and given the few things that Levinas wrote about psychanalysis, I don't see any way of reading this in this way. I think it's a very innocent word, I would say, within Levinas. But Simmel, it's more complex.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it's more complex because it's not a word of the beginning of his work. In the tragedy of culture, the word jouissance doesn't appear, as far as I remember. And in Philosophy of Monet, it appears only at the very end. At the very end. So one of the last pages. And so it's not something inherent to the economy. I mentioned the word jouissance because I made the hypothesis that it was a good criteria for the distinction of the question of Emmanuel about a pathological and a legitimate end. What does Simmel call jouissance? I'm afraid I'm not able to build a link with psychanalysis. It's just a lack of competence of myself, but I can try to explicit a little bit more what it means in Simmel. In my readings, Simmel sees the modern era as the possibility and the legitimacy of the self-expansion of the self. During all the history of humanity, the self-expansion of the self was not something legitimate. What was legitimate was the totality, the community, the institution, the power, the church. But I do not mean this way that in the history of humanity, self-expansion of the self didn't exist. I just said that it was not a source of ethical legitimacy in a life. And exactly the same way as Louis Dumont developed, and Louis Dumont mentioned Simmel at the end of his life, not at the beginning, but at the end of his life, he mentioned Simmel. Well, Louis Dumont said something like, well, I'm sorry, a large part of what I've said, Simmel had already said it, I'm sorry, I didn't know. But exactly as Louis Dumont, Simmel said that the characteristic, the specificity of the modern era is that the self-expansion of the individual, of the agent, of the singular individual persons, is an ethical, legitimate stake for life. And in my reading, what Simmel called enjoyment, and it's a French translation of the German word, and I don't know the German word. It's not that easy for me. But in my reading, enjoyment means nothing more, nothing less than self-elaboration of the self. And self-elaboration of the self in Simmel means reaching collectively legitimate ends. And this is the main tension, the main contradiction for Simmel of the modern era. That is, the meaning of my life is my self-expansion, but the criteria of a good self-expansion is collective. And this difficulty of being both individual and collective is the whole problem of the life of Simmel in my reading. So that's what I could say, try to explicit the word jouissance in Simmel. But unfortunately, maybe Andrzej can add on this, but I'm not competent enough in the words of psychanalysts to make a link and a difference.
Some of the time the question will be answered in the psychoanalytic terms. So, Simmel, as you presented, is a way of trying to reconcile the objective institutional sign with the subjective. This is very typical. Neo-Kantian world.
Yes, right.
And what is interesting in this question is that if we ask about the sense of enjoyment, you see that the problem is not in the contradiction between the objective and the subjective, but in the subject itself.
Except the fact that in Simmel, the self becomes himself through the collective production of cultural works. And so the individual becomes himself through the collective. And this is his problem.
So this is elaboration. Self elaborates.
Yeah,
Himself.
that's right. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No.
Being too talkative.
No. It was very interesting.
So I have the power to give myself a word. So I'd like to ask about something rather basic. One of our friends today told us a story about a student who was so naive and asked about the category of consciousness. And my question is similar, because for someone who didn't write a book about economy, it's not obvious that economy in theory of Levinas and theory of Simmel is the same. And I don't see, because maybe I don't know, I know one chapter from Simmel and some books of Levinas, not all. So my question is about this category of economy, because sometimes I had an impression that these levels are a little different. So, what criterion, what kind of theory we have to speaking about one category of economy, and it's linked with the question about culture, because I have the same impression. It's an impression that the culture and philosophy of Levinas is a little different than in Simmel's theory, because for Levinas, it's not very clear. The art culture is not extremely important thing, because some other level is important. In Simmel's theory, I have an impression that culture is very important, and the most of themes, subjects in Simmel's theory concern culture. So if we have this economy, which is one, and culture, which is one, how to connect this with these two theories? Because for you, it's obvious. For me, not. How to explain?
The word economy and the word culture, and here you are totally right, are the kind of words that are mostly ambiguous. I mean, the use of the word is really heterogeneous, very heterogeneous. Economy could have been mentioned by Wittgenstein as a linguistic interesting problem, just as we should think of it.
And Freud's also, in philosophy of Freud.
Yeah. And above all, the economy is very often used in a metaphoric meaning, and maybe in Freud, the profession of economy is not that of the professional of the economy. And in Levinas, the way he uses the word economy is incredibly heterogeneous. Incredible. We can make a map of all the occurrence of the word economy, and it doesn't mean the same thing. I've made the exercise. I've found something like 7 meanings that has nothing to do one with another. The purpose of the talk was not to enter, it was just for me a methodological approach of the question, but it was not the purpose. So the reason why I didn't mention that, but in a way, economy in Levinas is the social side of living. The economy of being, the expression the economy of being, probably the most numerous occurrence of the word economy in Levinas. Economy of being means clearly something like a social issue. But the economy is also the fact that the material needs of the other are my spiritual needs. And this is the use of the word that interests me. So we can argue that economy as itself, if the purpose of Levinas was to theorize, to build a theory of the economy, it would be a nightmare. But it's not his purpose. So he uses the economy as a multi-meaning metaphoric word. One of them, for me, is the one I am interested in. And it is the one that comes from the material need of the other, or my spiritual need. Within the very basic of eating, we touch immediately the major question of ethical philosophy. So if I want to put it in a very simple way, I would say that. So what is interesting in Levinas is that the economy, before being the system that the economists study, is the fundamental meaning of the relationship with the other as a whole. The other understood as a whole, first of all, is a whole in economy. I'm hungry. In Levinas, the economy is absorbed, is immersed in much more than the economy. This is the meaning of the sentence, the material needs of the other, and so on. Formally, it is the same thing in Simmel, but formally, only formally. Simmel doesn't have the same conception of the economy as Levinas, not at all. For him, it is one very important of social life, specific and characteristic of the modern era. He raises a lot of questions about what is this modern era, and he tried to understand it through the economy. And for him, finally, after research and research, finally, he finds that finally it is one manifestation of culture. Okay? But what is similar in Levinas and in Simmel, and what was supposed to be interesting for me, is the fact that for both of them, they immerse the economy within what they think is the most important element of social life for them. Levinas in the ethical life and Simmel in cultural life. So what is interesting in this is that economy in both philosophers are a sort of gateway to something which is the most important question of the humanity for them. It's not the same question, but for both of them, it's the most important question. And the economy is a direct way to go in it. And for me, it's fascinating. It's fascinating.
Thank you, Professor Michel, for your speech. So interesting. It makes me think about a lot of suggestions, possible suggestions. First of all, the problem of community, which I think is one of the basis of the problem of economics. Because we are not talking about production, we are talking about creativity in a certain way. I was thinking about the material phenomenology, that's from Michel. Third study is dedicated to the problem of community. And he says that the problem of community is the problem of life. But life intended as an alien perspective, from an alien perspective, which means the problem of auto-revelation, auto-manifestation of our intimacy. And this precedes, in a metaphysical sense, the problem of economics. And that's the reason why I think the way in which you presented economics, starting from a Levinas point of view, is so interesting because we should think about economics as a field in which we can explore ourselves. But when you mentioned the problem of keywords, desordre, in Levinas, it made me think about what the late Levinas said concerning the work, the capital letter, which is a sort of liturgical dedication to the otherness, which think about the output of our action as something of which we cannot be able to see the end, and we will not be able to enjoy the output of this action. Yeah. And in my opinion, starting from what you said, this brings this how to say, cut into it, destroying the totalization of economics. So if you want to think about, a phenomenological intersubject from an intersubjective point of view of economics, we have to overcome it, because economics in itself is unable to give us a human dimension of intersubjectivity, because it's simply a field. It's a sort of way and place in which humanity can be itself, but it's not. It's say, of course, it's an output. It's an object of humanity, but it's an alienated way in which humanity feels itself. And concerning this last point, it's so curious that in the second tome of Critique of Direct Feminism, Sartre wrote, I think, 300-400 pages, trying to describe the how to say, metaphysical and ethical structure of communist society. And he says that, many other things, he said that the communism is comprehensible because there is a leader in which and through which all the collectivity, the community stays together. And he wrote just one page dedicated to capitalism, and he wrote, "I'm unable to see that in capitalism." And I think that in a certain, from a certain perspective, we cannot think about this say, principle of unity. So I want to ask you, could money be this object of, I would say, the leader of our economical growth? Is the point in which our community, from an economical point of view, is unified, but it means it's alienated, so it's no longer human.
Well, to go directly to your final question, the answer would be, I would try to suggest a Simmelian answer. I mean, the answer is yes. I agree with your last point. But the fact that money is the unity for capitalism, and the fact that a chief in the communist system is the unity, in a way, for me, it is really important because both of them are alienating forces. And I have the feeling that the economy, when it becomes a separated category, moves to something very strange with his own immanent rules and norms, and an internal unity. which finally express just the system of the economy, whatever it is. There are many systems of the economy, but whatever it is, something expresses, and it is no longer humanity. But so I agree with that, and the fact that there is a sort of parallel in alienating unity is very interesting between the two systems. But this cannot hide the fact that in the economy there is also the humanity in itself. I mean, feeding the other is the humanity in itself. And it's something really strange, like the same category, and it poses a question of Monica, the same category covers two things very different. One is a systemic, a strange system with the unity that appear to be in production with anything human. And also it covers the fundamentally human relationship with the other. So, and this is both sides of the economy. Yeah? And what is interesting is that one side is that of Simmel and the other side is that of Levinas. But I mean that your question is totally right, and I'm convinced of what you said when I read Simmel. But when I read Levinas, the story might be a little bit different. Because we still have this sort of original ethical meaning of the economy. And what Levinas says that is interesting for me is that the economy is the field where you don't lose this original meaning, even in large-scale society. And here there is something to be understood. Because normally, when you leave the ethical self, you fell into the Simmelian and what you describe as a systemic with a strange unity. But what Levinas tried to teach us is that no. This is the case if you leave its way. If you leave the economy with its way. But your duty is not to do so. Your duty is to maintain humanity in economy, not to get rid of the economy, to maintain humanity within economy. And this is almost crazy. That's why I have the feeling that it's a real revolution in the meaning of the economy. Because even in Levinas, even when becoming social, it keeps its human meanings, and not only it keeps it, but it's a way where we can avoid to forget it. Because I am in a guilty or innocent relationship with anyone else.
So after 2 hours, we can finish our meeting. Thank you very much for your speech and discussion.
Thank you to
Thank
you.
And everybody, and I hope see you in 1 month with some of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Dziękujemy Pani Natalio, dziękujemy Magdo, dziękujemy wszystkim.